James Williamson. The story of a chance encounter that set a family up for prosperity in Otago. James Williamson was originally from Stirling, but he'd made a successful career for himself as a tanner. His old home here at Bleachfield in Falkirk, now the site of this large industrial brickworks. He was in partnership with his brother, and it was also here in Falkirk that he married his wife, Janet Mackey, in 1829. They had 3 children before relocating to Edinburgh in the late 1830s, where James set up as a provision merchant here in what was then called Ingliston Street, and 2 further children were born. Now, family tradition has it that James was a devout Presbyterian who was drawn into the great schism of the disruption of 1843, which saw the church split apart. His sympathies were with the breakaway Free Church group, and he was apparently considering immigration with fellow Free Church folk to Canada. But a chance encounter with the Reverend Thomas Burns on a train journey between Glasgow and Edinburgh convinced James Williamson to join the scheme to establish a settlement in Otago. James and Janet were also somewhat older than most of the immigrants in the pioneer party on the Philip Lang. They also had 6 children, some of whom were already in their teens, and they must have had their own feelings about leaving behind everything they'd ever known in Scotland for the uncertainty of a new life in a raw settlement at the bottom of the world. In any case, the 2 oldest Williamsons, 17-year-old Janet and 15-year-old Alexander, opted to stay behind, at least until the family was well established in New Zealand. On the other hand, being older and reasonably prosperous, James Williamson was one of the few Scots who could afford to buy one of the New Zealand company's Otago land packages. This brought with it free passage to the colony for his family, albeit in steerage. So it was that on the 27th of November 1847, James and Janet Williamson set sail for Otago on the Philip Lang with their 4 youngest children. Now, James's age and status made him a natural leader among his generally much younger fellow passengers. And so it was that when there was a revolt in steerage over inadequate rations, he was one of those who led a deputation to the captain to have things set right. He was also quicker than most to seize the opportunities of being early on the ground in Otago. And despite being struck down by a liver complaint that restricted his movements on first arrival, he made an early connection with Archibald Anderson, who'd been living here on the site of Dunedin already before the settlers arrived. Turned out that the Williamsons knew his brother back in Edinburgh. He therefore invited them to come and stay with him and gave James some excellent advice on where exactly to select his land sections. Now, finding connections from home like this is a recurring theme in pioneer stories, and it was vitally important as they networked and built a new community here in Otago. With his New Zealand company land package, he had 3 pieces of land to select, and for his quarter-acre town section, he chose a spot just here, where he then erected a store and began importing goods from his relatives in Scotland that were in demand and turned a tidy profit. His 10-acre suburban allotment, meanwhile, was here in Kaikorai Valley, just above Fraser's Gully. By 1849, the family had built a solid house here, cleared the bush, and were successfully growing crops, especially potatoes, for sale at their town store. In 1852, they sent for Janet and Alexander to join them in Otago, and some years later, Alexander built a substantial house called Kaikorai Bank, like the original farm, which is probably the oldest house in the valley. Finally, there was the 50-acre rural section for which James chose a site at what is now Wiley's Crossing, which he called Banterskin, after an estate near his old property in Falkirk. It would be a development project for his second son, John. James Williamson liked Otago from the minute the Philip Lang sailed up the harbour. He described it in a letter home as the beautiful haven of Otago. The gamble of coming here rather than going to the better-known Canada certainly paid off for this pioneer settler. Its free church character was just what he was looking for, while his land selections proved judicious, setting up his family for a prosperous future that went hand in hand with the colony's progress. The store in town, the small farm in Kaikorai Valley, and the rapidly expanding one at Banterskin all proved highly successful. When James Williamson died at Kaikorai Bank in October 1857, aged 59, he could look back on a decade of achievement in Otago and know that his wife and family were well provided for and could look forward to a much better future than they might have enjoyed in Scotland. And what more, after all, could any 19th century immigrant ask for?